More than a year on from the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, almost half of the world's students are still not back at school full-time, or even at all.
Welcome back, class.
An entire generation of school-aged children has been affected, yet it's the most vulnerable that have fallen furthest behind. As schools across the world reopen, there's a big challenge ahead, helping pupils make up for lost time. But there's also an opportunity to shake up the schools and education systems. Economist journalists spoke to subscribers about how the pandemic will radically change the future of education.
Hello, and welcome to another subscriber-only live event with The Economist. My name is Sasha Nauta. I am the public policy editor at The Economist. And today we're talking about getting kids back to classrooms. It's been an extraordinary year for children, but also, of course, for parents. I suspect many are listening in, and for teachers. And whilst for some, life is almost back to normal, for others, it most certainly is not. So we wonder, what have the effects on kids and their education been, and what could be done to catch them up? And also, might there be a silver lining for the future of schools on the back of this year? With me to discuss this are Mark Johnson, our education correspondent in London. Hello, Mark. And Tamara Gilkes-Bohr, our US policy correspondent in Washington, D.C. Hi, Tamara. Thank you both for joining. Right, so Mark, let's start with you. Looking back over the year, can you just start with giving us a sense of scale? How many kids have been out of education, and where, and for how long?
Awful year it's been. I was in China in February 2020 when children there were asked not to return to school after the Lunar New Year, not long after this extraordinary lockdown on the city of Wuhan. And what a long time ago that seems now. So school closures began spreading internationally in March of 2020. They reached a peak in April 2020 when 165 countries had nationwide school closures. So that affected more than 1.6 billion children and young people. And that was 85% of all of the world's learners. So it's some small mercy to say that things got gradually better after that. But there have been very wide disparities in the amount of time that children have had to spend outside of their classrooms since then. Now, UNESCO collects data on this. They count the length of time that children in different countries have had to put up either with full closures, full nationwide closures, or with partial closures in which only certain regions or certain grades have had to stay off school. And we have a map here that shows you what that looks like. By the end of March this year, countries had on average suffered nationwide school closures lasting 6 and a further 10 weeks of partial or regional closures. So that means that on average, children around the world have lost or had their schooling disrupted in some way for about 2/3 of the full school year. Now, I mean, who has suffered worst? Broadly, countries in East Asia and in Europe have done the best job of holding down the amount of time that's been lost to school closures. And broadly, disruptions have gone on longest in South America and in South Asia.
And just building on that, Mark, time is one measure. The other, I guess, is how closed was, right? Some schools and some countries seem to have made big efforts with virtual learning. Others had nothing at all. We have a reader called Gideon who wonders which countries did virtual learning well and which kids particularly suffered whilst schools were closed.
Yeah, so last summer, UNICEF calculated that perhaps 30% of children around the world had no access at all to, broadcast learning, radio and television, or any kind of digital internet learning. And it said that probably it was a much higher number than that were accessing no learning at all. So for lots of children around the world, having no school in person has meant effectively having no school. I mean, that's a good question about where has suffered worst. I would say it would be those places where children do not get that much schooling in the first place. So if you look at parts of East Africa, look at South Sudan, children there have lost about 1/6 of all the schooling they might be expected to have in total throughout their lifetimes. I mean, let's talk about some countries that have done very badly. The Philippines has had its schools closed for about a year, and more than that, it's had rules that require children to stay inside for most of that time. India, it had a brief period when it began to open schools at the start of this year. Now it's been hit by this awful, devastating wave, but children there have been out of school for a very long time. I would say Brazil and Mexico have also had extremely long school closures. And I think one would also think of America, where there are children who have not been back to school into their buildings for a full year.
Well, yeah, let's bring in Tamra there. I mean, Tamra, you've spent a lot of time this year speaking to educators as well as kids and parents in the States. It's been very hard to get a singular picture of what's going on in America. Maybe there is not a singular answer, but if we just look at the States, how well has America done in terms of bringing virtual learning to kids while schools were closed?
So in terms of virtual learning, we're seeing overall that schools had at least remote learning. Where we see a lot of the controversy is about which schools were allowing more traditional in-person type of learning and which schools were continuing to close. And I think that there's really three main ways to think about which schools ended up having in-person and which didn't. And the first major reason was politics. Especially during the Trump administration, you could essentially decide or tell which schools would be open, which would be closed based on whether they were team blue or team red, whether they were Republican or Democrat. But also we saw a really big difference in terms of the experiences with COVID. Many, as we know, Black and Hispanic communities have been hit very hard with COVID infections and deaths. And certain communities have had really high rates of COVID while others haven't. And sometimes in the same school district, like New York City, we would see some areas that had relatively low COVID rates, and in other areas, mostly predominantly minority, having high rates. So on top of politics, we also saw that a lot of minority parents were hesitant to send their children to school because of those high COVID rates.
Got it. Well, let's get back to that in a second. Before we move to where we are now, where we hope to go next, I just wonder, maybe I'll start with you, Mark, and then move to you, Tamra. The Economist, quite early on, I believe, in late April already, called on policymakers to make schools sort of top priority once it was safe enough to start opening up. And if I recall, one of our concerns was learning loss and the broader impacts of keeping kids out of education for long. Mark, can you tell me a little bit of what we've learned so far and what the impact of this year may have been on children?
Well, even before this awful catastrophe, there was a learning crisis in developing countries. So before the pandemic, a little over half of 10-year-olds in low and middle-income countries could not read and understand a simple story. So the pandemic is only going to have made that situation worse. And the most pessimistic predictions from the World Bank are that the share of illiterate children in these kinds of countries is going to increase from about half, perhaps to as high as 60%. So that is one potentially very serious ramification of what's happened. And of course, it's not all about learning. So there are very serious concerns about children's welfare. Children in developing countries who spend time out of school are more likely to end up finding themselves in work, getting married, getting pregnant, and perhaps not going back to school at all. So I think actually the scale of those problems we're still trying to get a handle on. And I mean, rich countries they will not have such catastrophic results from this, but they will have their problems too. So we've had 2 lockdowns in Britain. After the first one, we know that primary age children are about 2 to 3 months behind where they should be. They will probably have fallen further behind in their learning now. And there are worries about welfare there too. There are many worries about children's mental health. And there are concerns that we've seen reports of abuse, child abuse, decrease during this time, probably because teachers are often the first people to spot when something is wrong, and they've not been with their pupils for much of this year.
It's been quite a year, hasn't it? If there are silver linings, which we're always looking for, to realise just how many functions schools normally perform, and one of them is a social one, especially for developing social skills for younger kids. Tamara, I wonder, especially if you look at the youngest kids, quite a few experts called on opening schools and preschools especially early because of their stages of development. What can you tell me about the types of impacts that we might know about or fear about for those very young children who've been out of educational settings for a while now?
Yeah, so we know that overall in the US, we saw enrollment declines, but they were particularly strong in the youngest grades in kindergarten, for example, where students really benefit from the in-person aspects of learning. We all know that young children, it's going to be a lot harder to engage them and teach them through remote learning, through Zoom or other online platforms. Schooling for those children is really about social interaction, learning about how to behave and act and do school. And of course, there's generally just other types of skill development that like learning to line up and being polite and sharing that is really hard to do remotely. So while all students were definitely impacted negatively, we are concerned about the fact that many parents made the choice to essentially redshirt their children and not send them into school this year, the youngest children. So we have to think about what kind of impact that will have on enrollment later, and whether or not those children will just do kindergarten again or potentially actually just go right into first grade. We'll have to see.
I think it might be useful to talk a little bit about where we are now, 15 months into this crisis. So the UNICEF statistics, the people that are doing probably the best job collecting data around the world, suggest that as of now, there are actually still about 25 countries that have zero access to school, that have nationwide school closures. And beyond that, there are still about 300 million kids who are living in places where there is some level of partial disruption. So that's kids that are either unable to access their classrooms in certain regions or just pupils in certain grades who are still locked out. So if you put that together, that still means that there are 40 to 50% of all of the school-age children in the world suffering from some kind of disruption as a result of the pandemic. And how has back to school gone around the world? Well, I mean, generalizing enormously, I think you can say that in Europe, governments have done a reasonable job of ensuring that schools have been the last things to close and the first things to open, at least compared to many other places. And in Europe, reopening has basically gone according to a sort of, well, many governments have opted for sort of big bangs in which all of children return at the same time. So that's what we saw France do quite early on, in fact, at the end of the last summer. And that's what we saw Britain do to get kids back to school after its second lockdown, which ended a couple of months ago. And in those places, kids have gone back all at the same time, and they've largely gone back without limits on the number of people that are allowed to be in classrooms at any one time. If we look elsewhere, in East Asia, in South Korea, China, we see something similar to what's gone on in Europe, but we've seen governments switch on and off remote learning relatively seamlessly, relatively effectively. They've been quite tactical. They've switched it off in certain kinds of cities or in for certain grades, according to their demands to get COVID infections right down to zero. And I think in bits of Africa, you're more likely to find a situation where there are rotas for schooling, where there are shortened school days, and there are children that are going in 2 shifts, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, in order to allow for social distancing. And then finally, when you're looking at these sort of buckets of reopening strategies, I think you also have America in a category something of its own, where the majority of schools now have kids back in the building, but most of them are giving parents the option to choose whether they want their children to come in or to carry on remote learning. And they're trying to serve both of those constituencies simultaneously.
Thanks, Mark, and well saved. I thought I'd illustrate the joys of ed tech by having a little internet failure at my end, but well saved. And that's smooth. That's a good transition to you, Tamara. Why has it been so particularly patchy in America? And what kind of barriers are you looking at that are still stopping quite a few kids from returning to the classrooms?
Yeah, so this is a good time actually to pull up a chart by Burbio. So we can see, as Mark mentioned, that in the US, we've seen that not many students are actually in traditional learning. And over the past year, we've actually seen that the US has not done a great job of getting children back to traditional types of learning, being in the building at all times. In terms of the barriers, so as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that determined whether or not a school would be open or closed was just politics. Were you Team Trump and believe that you had to be in person, or were you Team Democrat / Biden and felt like we have to keep children home to be safe? But another reason that we're seeing such a wide range of decisions in the U.S. Is that COVID rates differed, as I mentioned earlier as well. Some communities were just really hit hard by COVID. And that is combined with the third reason for such a wide range, which is that there's just great inequality in the US in terms of schools and school buildings. And while we know that there's a lot of, schools in low-income areas that have really dilapidated buildings, it was kind of, I guess, in the past, not viewed as a public health concern, but COVID really made that clear that when you have these old buildings with poor ventilation systems, for example, or crowded classrooms, it becomes really hard to keep children safe. So you would see even in like the same school district, for example, like New York City, you would have some communities with really high COVID rates and also really poorly ventilated buildings that would mean that children were less safe. And then in the same district, in maybe let's say Manhattan, you're seeing that they have much better buildings or they have much lower rates of COVID infections. So even as Mark mentioned, when school districts would technically open, you would see that some students would return and some wouldn't. And a lot of times that was in a racial divide. In Chicago, we saw that in March when the lower grades returned to school, the majority of students who returned were the white students, the students who had lower COVID rates in their communities and were opted in better schools and had better facilities. So it's a complicated picture. Politics, of course, the state system in the US, but also just the real realities of COVID and inequality broadly really made it difficult to return this year. And hopefully we won't see that in the fall, but we'll see.
What sort of metrics will you be looking at, Tamara, in the fall to establish, whether things have got better? Is it simply, bums in seats, as we would say, or is there different metrics that you'll look at to see whether inequality has indeed widened in education?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it'll just be looking at the racial differences, particularly in those big school districts that have diverse populations, seeing do we have an equal percentage of students across races and income levels actually attending school in person? I think, parents know what's happening. They know when their communities have high rates of COVID. They know when their children aren't safe. And it doesn't matter at the end of the day if a politician says, yes, we're going to open schools If parents don't think that their children will be safe, they won't send them, especially when they have a remote option. So I think taking a really close look at that data and with an eye on income disparities and racial disparities will be really important.
Yeah. Now, I see that we're getting lots of questions about inequality, so let's dig into that a little bit. Mark, John is asking, COVID's impacted those from lower income families far worse. What can and should be done to help them catch up? I know you've done quite a bit of work on catch up. Maybe can you tell us a bit of what's been done so far? And indeed, as John asked, what more could be done?
Well, I mean, I think catch-up is extremely important, and it's important because the worry is that children have not only fallen behind, but might continue falling behind after they get back to their classrooms. So, getting kids back into school is not the solution. It's the beginning of the solution. But if children have missed important lessons, if remote learning has not supplied them with foundational stuff in maths and reading, and then schooling continues without appropriate remediation, you're going to find that it doesn't make much sense to them. And you're going to find that they fall further back than they were even when they came back to school. And that's been the lesson from some similar crises, earthquakes and so on, that have seen school closures in developing countries. So getting this right is very important. And broadly, there are three buckets of kind of catch-up strategies that you can employ. So one is adding more school time through extended days or perhaps through summer learning. A second strategy that you can employ is changing the curriculum. So perhaps removing things that don't seem quite so important as they did when time didn't seem such a pressing issue. And the third thing that you can do is change your method of instruction, try and improve the quality of your instruction, perhaps, for example, by making class sizes smaller, or even with something like tutoring, one-on-one tutoring or small group tutoring. And I think a good catch-up strategy, a good national catch-up strategy, is going to involve bits of all of those. I mean, broadly, I'm more skeptical about adding time because I think that's not often a very it's not a very focused, targeted strategy. It can be expensive. It's often resisted by teachers. And, there's lots of talk about summer learning opportunities. And to be honest, I think we should throw the kitchen sink at this. But the problem with summer schools is that the kids you really want to come often don't turn up, or they don't turn up long enough to take advantage of the opportunity. So I would say that I'm more excited about the sort of enthusiasm there has been for tutoring, for small group instruction, for sort of innovations in improving the quality of learning like that.
Now, there have been a few rich countries, including the one I'm in, the Netherlands, and the one I think you're in, Britain, that have indeed announced ambitious targets for tutoring. But tutoring is also expensive, right? So what hope is there for poorer countries in terms of catch-up, Mark? I mean, I can imagine that we'll only grow further apart in terms of our educational attainment if you just look at the globe for a second. What sort of solutions would you point to for less rich countries?
Well, there are opportunities in developing countries and very important ones. So there's been a resurgence of interest in an intervention called teaching at the right level, which effectively is a form of tailored instruction is what they would call it. But effectively it involves grouping the children into groups that match their learning levels, their skills, rather than their ages, but only for short periods of time, say for about an hour a day. And then during that hour, dispensing with the usual curriculum and instead focusing hard on fundamentals in maths and reading. And if that seems straightforward, it's actually something of a change for many of these school systems where teachers don't usually have the permission or indeed the training to go back and help children catch up with things that they've missed, and so we're seeing that sort of expand. It came out of South Asia and it's expanding in Africa even before the crisis, and lots of countries are redoubling their efforts. And one reason why it's especially interesting and exciting, I think, is because this is the kind of intervention that will not only help children get back learning time that they may have lost during the pandemic. But the big opportunity is that this could help them recover learning that they lost years before and do something about this learning crisis in which so many children in the developing world who have been sat obediently at their desks for so many years have actually not been learning nearly as much as they should have been.
Let's talk about that opportunity in a second. Before we go there, Tamara, I wonder, you've been known to really dig into specific policy initiatives. Is anybody in America anywhere doing something interesting on catch-up that might be worth highlighting?
Yeah, there's a lot that's going on that I think is really interesting. I would say that it's not just about catch-up, it's also about just being innovative. So obviously this has been a really tough year for many students and many teachers and parents. But one of the things that we have to think about is that schooling, the way it was before the pandemic, didn't work for a lot of students. We had high dropout rates, particularly among low-income people and students of color. And to go back to that regular way just isn't going to be satisfactory. We have an opportunity right now to really change things up. And I saw one example in Plano, Texas, where they found that a lot of their students were not enrolling in school. And they came up with a bunch of strategies, just knocking on doors and really, trying to find students where they were, helping them get the resources they needed, like a bed and food, which, we should continue things like that to make sure that students always have what they need to be able to learn properly. But I also saw that this same school district had this interesting idea to go hybrid for their older students, not just because we need to go hybrid for the pandemic, but because the older students needed to work to support their families because they were struggling financially. So they started allowing their students to go to school in person a couple of days a week, and then they had more flexibility about when they would turn in their remote work so that these students could balance working and school. And that's not something that I think should end when the pandemic's over. These are things and problems that have existed before. And, not to get ahead of everything right now, but one of the silver linings in all this is that I think that COVID has highlighted the inequalities that have existed for a long time. And it'd be a shame if we didn't take this opportunity to really bridge those gaps and meet students where they are so that we can improve student outcomes overall.
Well, no, let's get ahead of ourselves. I mean, never waste a crisis, right? Build back better is something you see sort of plastered across broken policy areas, and education perhaps is one of the most obvious ones. I wonder if both of you, I'll start with you, Mark, and then move to you, Tamara, if you just step way back from all of the constraints and all the realities of education systems and budgets and teachers and buildings and all of those things, exams not to mention, what opportunity do you see for, I don't know if we can quite say reinventing, but certainly for changing how we educate children on the back of this extraordinary year? What opportunities or indeed silver linings do you see, Mark?
So what opportunities? I mean, there's a certain unreality about this debate, although it's interesting to engage in. But we're in a situation where quite a lot of American children have not been back to school at all. So I dare say that the priority needs to be to fix the problems that we have right in front of us. But no, you're right. Let's never waste a crisis. I think I hope that we will see schools take more advantage of the sort of huge increase in parental engagement. So parents have never been so enthusiastic. So, I mean, they've been completely destroyed by online learning and supporting homeschooling, but they're taking an enormous interest. They've never been so well informed about their children's learning. And there are opportunities to take advantage of that. We know that when parents are involved, outcomes for children are better. And there's lots of new technologies that schools can use to keep them engaged, to keep them updated. So I think we should do that. I mean, I think there are opportunities in digital. So this has been an opportunity for schools, for teachers, for pupils, and for parents to learn better about EdTech, to learn about what works and what doesn't. And for some children, remote learning has worked better. I dare say for a minority, but for some, for those who are, perhaps very bright and move a lot quicker than others, for those who suffer anxiety or shyness or just a bit quieter, I think they're doing better. So we will probably see innovation in online learning. We'll probably see better solutions for those children who benefit from online learning, and we'll probably see sort of interesting innovations like hybrid schools, part-time schools, which were already growing in some rich countries before this pandemic.
Before I move to Tamara, actually, just to build on some of the things that might be here to stay, Mark. Nick is asking, we're getting a lot of questions about tech and we're getting a lot of questions about exams, so I'll make sure we cover both. On tech, what online technologies have proven to be the most effective replacement for the classroom? Are there any particular things or particular activities that have done actually quite well virtually that might be here to stay?
Most of the remote learning technologies that have been employed during this period are actually very common technologies that aren't designed for education. So, it's been about Zoom, it's been about Teams, it's been about actually the very basic things. So, hopefully this is going to reorient thinking about edtech so that those people that would say technology is here and it's going to revolutionize everything immediately, it's sort of dampened down a lot of that chat, and I think hopefully made people become a bit more thoughtful about what is actually necessary. I mean, what I've heard from teachers is that there is more of a realization, and it was already there before, but more of a realization that a lot of class time is spent in some countries is spent lecturing, is spent conveying information that actually could be conveyed in advance through videos, through interactives, through things like that. So we may see more of this flipped learning when we get back to classrooms, in which a lot of the sort of content part of a lesson is delivered in advance, perhaps as homework, and then you use the lesson itself to actually work through problems to help students who haven't fully understood the material. And that's just a sort of simple way where better use of technology might lead to more effective use of classroom time. So, I have a feeling that it's these smaller steps forward that are going to be the ones that we really benefit from, rather than a sort of massive technological leaps that people sometimes thought were going to come along.
It sounds like... go on, Tamara, sorry.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Mark just said. I like to think of it in two buckets in terms of the relationship between technology and the pandemic. First, it's that teachers became a lot more willing and were forced to embrace technology. And the second thing is that EdTech became more realistic. So I was a teacher for 5 years in New York City, and I know you have so much going on in the classroom. Like, the last thing you want to do is have like 30 laptops with like just the logins don't work and the batteries are dead and the software doesn't work. So when the pandemic, one good thing is that it's forced teachers to have to deal with those things. They had to get laptops updated and up to date in their classrooms. They had to get students to really understand and learn how to use Google Docs and Microsoft Office. And not only is that important for, their life skills so that they can, use them in college or at work, but it's also important because Google Docs, for example, has allowed teachers to give students feedback in the moment. So, students are working in a group on a document and the teacher can see what they're doing. They can tag the teacher if they want feedback on a particular part of their essay or their worksheet. It's really, I think we're going to see amazing leaps there, where now that we education is really caught up, to the current tech state. But I also think, secondly, EdTech has gotten a bit more realistic about what their role is. As a teacher, I can tell you that EdTech often rubbed us the wrong way a little bit because they were like basically talking about replacing us. And I think pandemic has shown that we do not want to replace teachers. Families are really, really struggling right now, and they're realizing, wow, we need our kids not only to go to a physical place during the day, but we also need that social development, their peer interaction. Students are really suffering socially. And so we're seeing the social value of school. So I think another great benefit is that EdTech is going to EdTech is realizing what their role can be that will be really work well with what teachers need. They can make teachers' jobs more efficient. They can help us get rid of the paperwork and the things that really slow us down, so that we can focus on the things that you need a human for. So those are the two things I think will be really great about the pandemic.
Yeah, so basically enhancing teachers. I agree with you entirely. I think it's been a humbling moment for EdTech, hasn't it? I remember about a week into the pandemic getting lots of emails from investment bankers saying this is where EdTech takes over from the teachers, and I think that's been conclusively proven wrong. But Tamara, actually on that, and indeed, good reminder that you stood in front of the classroom for quite a while. Anna is asking, what does all this mean for teacher training? How have different countries address this, but also particularly if you go forward and tech does have some sort of role in the classroom of the future, what should that mean for teacher training, and is anybody already dealing with that?
Yeah, I'm really glad that that question came up, because I'm seeing some interesting technology in terms of teacher training coming out of academia right now. I'll let Mark talk about different countries, but we're seeing some research from researchers at the University of Virginia and Worcester Polytechnic Institute, where they're engaging some really cool, exciting technology to help train teachers. So, for example, one research group is using avatars to help simulate the classroom. So when I was a teacher, and I wanted to practice, I had to practice on real live students, and that did not go well. And it's what they're realizing now is that we might be able to use avatars, things like simulations, to teach really new teachers how to interact in the classroom before they get in front of live, impressionable students. So right now, the technology is still pretty, in the beginning stages, but they're hoping that we'll be able to have these automatic simulators, almost like what you see when you're training soldiers in combat. But now a teacher training a student teacher can actually just practice for a little bit in front of the avatar student instead. We're also seeing some exciting potential moves in terms of teacher feedback and evaluation. So when I was a teacher, if you wanted feedback, you had to beg your principal to come in. You had to get a veteran teacher in the classroom to come in and use their prep time or their lunch time to observe you. But we're seeing some interesting work with neural networks and AI to be able to process videos and transcripts so that teachers could hopefully eventually one day upload their video or upload a transcript of their classroom and get feedback on rubrics about the classroom climate, whether or not they have a positive experience or climate in the classroom, whether or not their questions are at the level of rigor that we want. And I can tell you that in my first few years especially, but all throughout, teachers are begging for that kind of feedback. So to be able to get that in a way that is quick, doesn't require a ton of people in the classroom is important in general, but particularly during a pandemic.
Got it. We're going to have to race through the last few because we're getting a lot of sudden late submissions of questions we don't want to race through. Mark, unsurprisingly, we're getting a lot of British questions about exams, or rather questions about exams from people in Britain. I'm going to blend them together. I'm just going to credit David, Michelle, Robin and Anna with these. They are asking two things. Firstly, is the UK experience typical? So with maybe you can explain a little bit how Britain has approached grading this year. Is that typical of what's been happening in the rest of the world? And then secondly, do you see this experience changing the role of exams in the future of education?
All excellent questions. I really haven't had to make decisions about this because it's been incredibly difficult. But for those who aren't following, for those who aren't British, Britain has these very significant high stakes national exams that kids take when they're 16 and 18. And for 2 years running now, they have been cancelled for various reasons related to the pandemic with various justifications. Are these cancellations typical of what's happened around the world? I mean, I would say Probably not. Britain's not alone in this experience, but there was huge disruption caused to national examinations last year, and indeed still is this year. We often saw countries delay exams by up to a couple of months. We often saw countries make enormous changes to exams to reduce the amount of content examined. And then we saw some countries cancel them entirely, of which Britain was one, or England, all of the four nations that make up Britain. And indeed, I would say that it's odd because Britain tends to rely on high-stakes examinations to count on them more than other countries, but has been slightly keener than other countries to cancel them. And we see this year, for example, Ireland right next door had similar lengths of school closures, but has decided that its school leavers exams will go ahead for those who still want to sit them. So it hasn't been a completely obvious decision to cancel them. Is it going to change how we deal with exams in the future? I think all it's done is sharpen the debates that existed before. So people who don't really like exams are saying, well, look how vulnerable they are to disruption. And people who are big fans of exams are saying, look what a disaster it's been trying to do without them. This is why we have to have them back. So I think I don't think it's going to fundamentally change the approach to exams. I think we may realize that certain sets of exams are not quite as important as we thought they were, certain specific types of exams. So we may see, for example, that in Britain, the GCSEs that kids take when they're 16 years old, we may realize that they're not quite as important as they used to be when kids were able to leave school at 16. And in America, we're seeing a sort of reduction in the value of the SATs that students take to try to get into university. Those are becoming increasingly optional. So there will be some changes, but I don't see a fundamental transformation resulting.
And just quickly, Mark, if I may, Samuel's asking about grade inflation and whether I'm paraphrasing you here, Samuel, whether we're about to see a whole cohort of kids go to universities that they normally wouldn't have gotten into. Is that something to worry about?
The answer is yes, we're going to see massive grade inflation. Are we going to see lots more kids go to university this year that wouldn't otherwise? I don't know. We saw that last year because the grade inflation was a surprise. I think this year the universities are expecting the grade inflation, as I understand it, making less offers. Yeah.
Okay, Tamara, quick one for you from the US side of things. Do things look radically different in terms of the future of exams on the back of this, or is it pretty much what Mark's just been talking of? Yeah. Okay. Great.
Yeah. I think I agree with a lot of what Mark said in the British context. So right now, SAT optional. Let me be quick. I think we will see SAT optional. I don't think we will see exams get completely thrown to the side, but I can't imagine that schools will require them anymore after this.
Got it. And whilst you've got the mic, Tamara, here's my last question for you both. You've given us a great oversight here, but if policymakers or indeed school officials are listening right now, what is the single thing you would recommend they do to get kids back to the classroom, which is sort of our overarching theme here? Tamara, why don't you go first? What's top of your wish list, and then you, Mark?
This is going to sound really obvious, but we have to get COVID rates down. That is America generally is doing better, but there are a lot of communities where COVID is still, infections are rising, and we have to make sure that our schools are safe.
And Mark?
Well, to risk wading into the American debate, I think there have to be some decisions made about how long school districts are going to keep offering online learning in places where COVID rates are low, because I think there's a risk that while pupils can still have the choice of online learning or coming into a classroom, we're going to see a sort of two-tier education system emerge, and I don't think that would be very helpful.
That's interesting. So you actually think hybrid is not necessarily a positive. If you keep hybrid, depending on what you mean with it, forever, you could end up with a two-tier system. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what's happening in America, where in Britain, when the schools opened, kids were supposed to go back to class, and they were effectively compelled to. Now, I don't think you could do that in America, and perhaps you wouldn't want to. But while there is the option of studying entirely online or studying in person in the same school, you're going to see continued separation and, yes, a two-tier system in the end.
That's really interesting. Okay, well, I know, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Tamara. I know you are together working on a briefing on the back of this subject, which will hopefully come out in a future issue of The Economist. So do look out for that. Thank you all for joining the subscriber event. We miss you. We wish we could see you in person. If you'd like to find out more about our upcoming events, please click the link below. There you'll also find more information about previous sessions, such as the one on the future of work or what the next decade will hold for climate change. See you next time.